To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
Well, they seem sincere. This is going to be another slightly grim topic, I'm afraid, but at least it's not COVID, and I promise it'll be interesting. I'm wearing a turtleneck, like no one in a turtleneck has ever not been interesting. That's right. Anyway, this time we're talking about the Iraq War and genocide. In 2003, in the wake of 13 years of crippling sanctions imposed on it by the US and the UK, Tony Blair and George Bush invaded Iraq. This war was broadly justified on two separate claims. One, that Iraq had nuclear weapons and posed a threat to the US and the UK, which was, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, a massive lie. And two, that the US and the UK had a humanitarian goal in freeing the Iraqi people from a violent tyrant, which was both a massive lie and a massive case of self-delusion. In this video, I'm going to show how the real interests being served of the Iraq War were in fact the colonial expansion of neoliberal ideology and economics into an area which up until the war had resisted them, and how this whole process could be justifiably called genocidal. So let's first look at the happy topic of genocide. I had to do some lighter topics, man. Finally make that video on Chicken Run. So when we on the left talk about the Iraq War in its broader context, we're generally aware that it was a terrible act of unjustifiable war. But when I was researching this video, I noticed there were features of both the war and the pre-war period of economic sanctions against Iraq, which were consistent with my understanding of genocide. So here I'm going to defend the position that the US and the UK engaged in the genocide over about 20 years in Iraq. Often when we think of genocide, we think of it as only mass killing of a particular ethnic group. Only mass killing. But recently, researchers have tried to refine our understanding by returning to the writings of the man who first coined the term, Raphael Lemkin. For Lemkin, the crime of genocide is not just mass killing of a group, but the process of its complete destruction. This can take the form of mass killings, but can also take the form of what's called cultural genocide, which is the destruction of a group's collective memory and identity through the destruction of its culture. This could take the form of the destruction of cultural artifacts, the banning of languages, or stealing land, or any number of other dimensions. But simply put, it is a destruction of who they are as a people. According to Dr. Damien Short, who's my PhD supervisor, Lemkin viewed mass killing genocide and cultural genocide not as two distinct concepts, but as one process which can reach the same end through different means. And this makes sense if you think about what it is that mass killing of a cultural group is actually doing. Because it's not just simply killing lots of people, but it's destroying them as a collective. It's destroying their collective memory, their cultural collective identity. It's destroying a culture through mass murder. Thinking this way, we can see how mass killing and cultural destruction are different ways of reaching that same goal of destroying a people. So if the same ends can be reached through cultural destruction, it means that it's not necessary for a genocide to be an explicit project of mass murder. In fact, Lemkin saw genocide as an innately colonial project, where mass death is rarely the explicit goal, and not often the primary means through which genocide is actually enacted. Instead, genocide by colonial powers often destroys the culture of an indigenous group and forces them into the cultural mould of the occupying, colonising power. Like the Australian government taking away indigenous children from their families and placing them with white families. The cultural identity is killed, but not necessarily the individual, though the colonial and genocidal process most often involves both. Viewed in this way, it also becomes clear that to commit a genocide, actors don't need to set out with an explicit goal to exterminate a nation or an ethnic group through either mass killing or cultural destruction. For example, it's definitely the case that colonialism is genocidal, but it's not the case that colonial powers had the explicit goal to commit genocide. In fact, colonial powers often lied to themselves that they were helping colonised peoples become civilised. But this doesn't abdicate the moral responsibility of colonial powers like the British Empire, because while the goal in colonialism was the gain of economic and territorial benefits, the national and cultural destruction, the genocide, of indigenous people was the undeniable effect. And while there's lots of different reasons why the simple definition of genocide as mass killing became the common one that we all think of, a significant part of this reason is that during the process of institutionalizing this radical anti-colonial concept into the Charter of the UN, the dominant colonial world powers sought to soften it because they didn't want to be accused of cultural genocide. Churchill didn't want to be seen as Hitler, though there were similarities. That's a wee spicy take to get the Conservatives riled up and bullying me in the comments. If you want to bully me in the comments, go right ahead. To sum up, genocide is not simply mass killing, but the destruction of a group or a people which can be done through cultural destruction as well as mass murder. It's also closely linked to colonialism, which you should keep in mind because it will come up later. So we've established an idea of genocide. The next question is, did the US and UK commit genocide in Iraq? Well, if we start immediately with mass killing, we can see that over a period of 20 years, the US and the UK led actions which resulted in a devastating loss of life in Iraq. From 1990 until 2003, the US and the UK imposed devastating sanctions which stopped the supply of food, running water, medicine and electricity. Over 12 years, this killed an estimated 1.5 million people, including over 500,000 children. This is more than were killed by the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Japan. 2 Assistant General Secretaries of the UN in a row quit their positions because they believed that these sanctions, which were backed by the UN, were explicitly genocidal.
And when you set out to help these children, you were the United Nations representative here.
That's right.
And to do it, what you're saying is you had to act illegally.
I had to breach my own economic sanctions, so to speak, established by the Security Council, as we know, led by Washington and by London. I think in this hospital we've seen today evidence of the killing that is now the responsibility of the Security Council member states, particularly, I think, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair.
And on top of this, in terms of war deaths, as of 2006, there were around 650,000 Iraqi deaths due to the war, but 14 years later, this figure could be described as a low estimate. Like the war destabilised the region and caused it to enter a spiral of violence, which included the creation of ISIS. And on top of this, the use of depleted uranium ammunitions by US and UK forces has been attributed to long-term health problems in Iraqi population, including a massive spike in childhood leukemia and genetic malformations within babies. With this astronomical death toll, we might justifiably make the case that the sanctions and war in Iraq constituted a genocide. Certainly, it was mass murder. But there are further dimensions which more clearly indicate that this was more than just mass killing, but a process of cultural destruction, which is central to genocide. Firstly, we can look at what the motives behind the Iraq invasion were. While appeals were made to international security and humanitarian concerns about the brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein,
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
the true motives were to remove Hussein and create an economic and political model of how the US wanted the Middle East to look. For the US, it was a global experiment in behaviorism. It was described by a media figure close to the administration of George Bush like this: "We're not doing nation building in Iraq, we're doing nation creating." But to create a new nation from scratch, the pre-existing nation must, by definition, be destroyed. And we can see this cultural destruction when we look at the large-scale looting of cultural artefacts which occurred and which the US and UK troops took no action in preventing. And you might argue that, the looting wasn't done by US or UK soldiers, so it's therefore no accusation of cultural destruction on the part of the US or UK. There's no responsibility. But I don't think that really holds water. Not only did troops not take action in stopping it, but in the run-up to the war, the US government was warned that this cultural destruction would definitely happen. I mean, experts knew from the previous Iraq war under George Bush's dad, George Bush, that this looting was an inevitability, that the US and UK deliberately created the conditions in which they knew cultural destruction would happen and then did nothing to stop it, points in some sense to this cultural destruction being a deliberate tactic. And this is further bolstered by the fact that they were, by their own admission, engaging in not nation building, but nation creating. But even if you don't want to accept that this is a deliberate tactic, we know from our definition of genocide that we established earlier that cultural destruction doesn't have to be the goal of the genocidal actor, merely the effect of their actions. And this was undoubtedly the effect of US and UK actions. A further point in the genocide column would be that when the US took control over every function of the state in Iraq, one of the first things that they did, and we'll explore why in a minute, was to strip the university and education system down and remake it entirely from scratch. The people in charge of this process explicitly saw anything that remained of Iraqi culture in the education system as a block to their nation creating. This was the end of a process of educational destruction which started with the economic sanctions in the 1990s, before which Iraq had one of the best educational systems in the region, and a literacy rate of 89%, which is much higher than a lot of US states today. But today the Iraqi literacy rate is around 40%. If this doesn't point to cultural destruction, then I don't know what would. And can you see the link to colonialism throughout all of this? The US and the UK took territory for their own economic interests, took control of the state, and tried to reforge Iraq in its own image. As Lemkin argued, genocide has two phases. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. The US and the UK not only killed millions of Iraqi people, but through their action engaged in a massive cultural destruction, the destroying of a national pattern of the oppressed group. And with the aim to impose a particular ideological vision of how a people and a state should be run, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressors. It may be hard for us to admit, but our states committed genocide in Iraq. So as I mentioned, the genocidal process in Iraq was all in service to a particular ideological vision of how states and the people within them should behave. The ideological vision of neoliberalism. This is an ideology which seeks to make the individual a true self-interested capitalist through the introduction of market forces into as many areas of life as possible. It involves the privatization of services, like the state education service, and the opening up of new areas to the free market access, like Iraq's vast oil fields. What happened in Iraq is what Naomi Klein describes as shock therapy. This is the process through which states which are going through political or economic or violent turmoil are exploited to pursue a severe program of privatization and neoliberalization. It's been pushed in various contexts like post-Soviet states like Poland, but in Iraq the shock was deliberately created by the US and the UK so that they could push their own therapy. They created the sickness so that they could sell their own cure. The architects of the Iraq War were both deeply ideologically committed to a neoliberal world order, but also had material interests at work in the state. Iraq had plenty to gain on both fronts. It held the third largest oil reserves on the planet and was also one of the last holdouts against the drive towards unfettered neoliberal world markets. You can almost hear the capitalists salivating. This war was a rational choice, both ideologically and materially, for the actors involved. They couldn't sanction their way into getting at the oil fields and opening up the economy to unfettered neoliberal markets. So they used war, colonialism, and genocide to do so. Washington's plan was to basically use the violence of war to destroy Iraq's infrastructure, to take control of and sell state-owned enterprises, to divide up the oil fields between foreign companies and remove from state hands the provision of services. Before the war, Iraq had a national oil company and over 200 state-owned firms, which produced most of its food, its industrial materials, and employed a huge number of its people. But after the Iraq War, the occupying forces privatized these companies, broke up and sold off the oil fields, and cut corporate tax rate from 45% to 15%. This was a classic neoliberal policy agenda. As a result, unemployment in Iraq soared, and the Iraqi people starved, while foreign corporations plundered the land to enrich themselves. The US occupiers drafted contracts between corporations and the Iraqi state, which would last 40 years, meaning that well after occupation had ended, the state would still be saddled with this sort of neoliberal, marketized vision, which was imposed on them by an occupying force. The US had control over everything in Iraq, and they outsourced every single government service from health to education to private US and UK companies. And it should be remembered that high-ranking members of the Bush administration had personal stakes in the businesses profiting in Iraq. A company called Halliburton was contracted to create the entire US military infrastructure, which had been compared to the creation of huge military city-states in Iraq, a service for which they were rewarded with billions of dollars. The thing is, Halliburton's former CEO was Bush's Vice President Dick Cheney, a man who Satan describes as a bit much. And it wasn't just Iraq that was privatised, but warfare itself, with 48,000 mercenaries deployed in the region, which is more than the combined number of troops deployed in the region by every state other than the US, which is mad. This was a neoliberal war, a war of private money and private plunder. The Iraq War was an expression of both an ideological drive to create a neoliberal world order and the rational self-interest of Western capitalist powers to increase their power and profit. It was the culmination of a process which started in 1990 with the first Iraq War, continued through extreme economic sanctions, and eventually led to the 2003 invasion. This entire process resulted not just in millions of deaths, but in the cultural destruction of a people. For this reason, I think that the situation in Iraq justifiably constitutes a neoliberal genocide. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you found it interesting, and it might sound weird, but I actually enjoyed making this video. I found the research incredibly interesting, and I think I've made, not to toot my own horn, I'm wearing a turtleneck so I'm allowed to be slightly arrogant. I think I've made an original argument here. So if you're gonna bully me in the comments, just know that it will hurt my feelings a lot.
And a massive thanks to my patrons Paul Singleton and Tamash Kispeter.
And if you'd like to become a patron and help me make more videos like this where I talk about depressing concepts, or Chicken Run, eventually I will talk about Chicken Run. It's been in my list for almost 6 months now. I want to talk about Chicken Run. That might also help me get through my PhD. So if you'd like to become a patron, links below. Also, if not, just like, comment, subscribe, and comment even if you are just going to bully me in the comments. I appreciate it. Cheers.